So thanks, Leonard, for the introduction. Thanks, Tobias and Lucia, for the invitation, the opportunity to be here. Thanks to all the organizers, all the participants for the fascinating talks, posters, conversations, and the great food. I'm very happy to be here to celebrate a book that's been so influential, so important, not just for the field in general, but also for my own development as a philosopher, as I belong to a generation who approached the philosophy of consciousness with the conscious mind as a key reference, if not the key reference. And on top of that, in the last years, Dave has been extremely important for me and my work, and I would probably be in a very different place, and a worse place, professionally and intellectually, if it wasn't for him. So thanks for the book, but thanks also for everything else. My talk will focus on Chapter 5 of The Conscious Mind, titled The Paradox of Phenomenal Judgment. The chapter raised what is, in Chalmers' own term, I quote, certainly the greatest tension that a non-reductive theory is faced with. So I must say it is my favorite chapter of The Conscious Mind, partly because it's really one where I think you have the feeling that you can witness someone here, Dave, grappling deeply and sincerely with a genuine problem for his own view. So it reads a bit like an adventure. And this chapter was also very important for me, because when I read the book as a student, at first I was actually pretty convinced by all the anti-reductionist arguments. I had read some of them in Levin's or Nagel's, but I was really convinced by the way Chalmers was marshalling all of these arguments. I was like, yes, he's right. So I was reading The Conscious Mind, or actually L'Esprit Conscient, because I read it in French as a typical monolingual French philosopher at the time. And then I turned to chapter 5, and that's when I became convinced by Chalmers himself that his view had to be wrong somehow. So what I want to do now is retrace a bit the history of the paradox of phenomenal judgment from its first statement in chapter 5 of The Conscious Mind to some more recent work by Chalmers and others. And I will conclude by explaining what I think we should do with regard to this paradox, namely, put it back onto its feet. So, here's how Chalmers introduced the paradox in The Conscious Mind. Consciousness itself cannot be reductively explained, but phenomenal judgments should be reductively explainable. It then follows that our claims and judgments about consciousness can be explained in terms quite independent of consciousness. More strongly, it seems that consciousness is explanatorily irrelevant to our claims and judgments about consciousness. This result I call the paradox of phenomenal judgment. So the most important concept here is the concept of phenomenal judgments, like physically, functionally conceived judgments about phenomenal consciousness. So because they are physically, functionally conceived, explaining them raises only easy problems, so arguably they can be explained reductively. But since Dave thinks phenomenal consciousness cannot be explained reductively, suggests that consciousness itself is, as he says, irrelevant to the explanation of phenomenal judgments. That's a paradox. So it's made more salient by appealing to zombies. So he wrote, think of my zombie twin. He talks about conscious experience all the time. In fact, he seems obsessed with it. And yet, he has no conscious experience at all. In his universe, the materialists are right and he is wrong. Most of his claims about conscious experience are utterly false. But there is certainly a physical or functional explanation of why he makes the claims he makes. Such an explanation must ultimately be in terms of physical processes and laws. There is room to be perturbed by what is going on. After all, any explanation of my twin's behavior will equally count as an explanation of my behavior, as the processes inside his body are precisely mirrored by those inside mine. It follows that the explanation of my claims is also independent of the existence of consciousness. So a bit later, Chalmers exposes the paradox more systematically. He presents us with 4 statements, and he wants to accept all 4, but taken together, they generate a tension. So here are the 4 statements. First, the physical is causally closed. Second, judgments about consciousness supervene on the physical. Then from 1 and 2, he naturally gets to A, judgments about consciousness are physically explainable. Third statement is that consciousness does not supervene on the physical. And then from A and 3, he, again, like not inevitably, but somewhat naturally reaches the conclusion B, consciousness is explanatorily irrelevant to phenomenal judgments. And finally, the fourth statement that he really wants to accept, of course, is that we know that we are conscious. So basically, the problem is that B, which sort of tells us that consciousness is explanatorily irrelevant to judgment, and which is a natural consequence of 1, 2, and 3, is really, really hard to square with 4, the statement that we know that we are conscious. So maybe it's not obvious to you why there is a tension there. So to help us see it, Chalmers offered 2 arguments, whose conclusion he, of course, rejected, but which purport to show that explanatory irrelevance implies or suggests that we don't know that we are conscious. So although Chalmers did not use the term at the time, these are in fact debunking arguments targeting phenomenal knowledge. The first argument he then considered was one from the justificatory parity with zombies. So basically, the idea is that given explanatory irrelevance, it seems really natural to think that zombies make the same judgments as us, and that these judgments are produced in them by the same mechanisms as in us. From there, it's very tempting to think that their judgments are as justified as ours, since they are produced by the same mechanisms. However, their phenomenal judgments are false and probably, for him, not well justified. Therefore, ours aren't either. However, if we are not justified, for instance, to judge that we are conscious, then we do not know that we are conscious. And the second debunking argument he considered at the time is one from the causal theory of knowledge. So the idea is that given explanatory irrelevance, it seems natural to think that conscious experience do not cause phenomenal judgments. However, assuming some sort of causal constraint on knowledge, where knowledge of X requires a causal link of the right sort between our knowledge and X, the conclusion is that we do not know that we are conscious. Okay, so there are many tempting reactions to this paradox of phenomenal judgment. Those that I find, of course, the most tempting, and which are actually deeply discussed in the chapter by Chalmers, are the following. First, we can, of course, reject 4 and maintain that, in fact, we do not know that we are conscious. This naturally leads to eliminativism. We are not conscious, at least, of course, we can specify, not in a sense that goes beyond judgment and does not supervene on the physical. Of course, another thing that we can do is just reject 3, the view that, remember 3 was the view that consciousness does not supervene on the physical, and then sort of maintain that consciousness does supervene on the physical. But I think at the end of the day, the most robust answer, and at least that's how Dave treats it, is probably one that combines 3 and 4, one that says that to the extent that consciousness does not supervene on the physical, like in the sense of consciousness in which consciousness does not supervene on the physical, we are not conscious. So our 4th theory, we do not know that we are. And to the extent that consciousness does supervene on the physical, then we know we are conscious, but in this sense, consciousness, of course, is explanatorily relevant to our judgments. So for Chalmers, of course, these reactions are not needed. We don't need to go for any of these reactions. Like other possible reactions would be variety of, for example, interactionist dualism. Like in the conscious mind, sort of rules them out, not really solving anything, but maybe some varieties could help. But anyway, for Chalmers, none of these reactions are needed. We can maintain statements 1, 2, 3, 4. How? Well, what we need to do is acknowledge the reality of acquaintance. So he wrote, experience is part of our core epistemic situation. Replace my bright red experiences by dull green experiences, and you change my evidence for some of my beliefs, including my belief that I'm having a bright red experience. There is something intrinsically epistemic about experience. To have an experience is automatically to stand in some sort of intimate epistemic relation to the experience, a relation we might call, quote, acquaintance. There is not even a conceptual possibility that a subject could have a red experience like this one without having any epistemic contact with it. To have an experience is to be related to it in this way. So the idea is that thanks to consciousness' unique justificatory profile captured by the notion of acquaintance, we know about our own consciousness in spite of its explanatory irrelevance. we are not at justificatory parity with zombies, even if our judgments are indeed produced by similar mechanisms, since just by having conscious states, we have a justification to believe, and right justification to believe in those conscious states, one that zombies lack. And the causal theory of knowledge does not apply to consciousness, since we are acquainted with conscious states, and this provides justification for our beliefs, transforming them into knowledge, independently of what caused the underlying judgments. So interestingly, in this quote, Chalmers suggests, without exactly saying, if you look at the formulation, that it is conceptually necessary that conscious experiences are objects of acquaintance. So if so, this actually makes acquaintance really special, because in the conscious mind, pretty much all the positive features Chalmers ascribes to consciousness, like its link to cognition, its supervenience and functional organization, all of these features, they're understood as holding out of mere nomological necessity. So acquaintance, as far as I know, as far as I could find, might be the only positive substantive feature of consciousness which the conscious mind sees as possibly holding out of conceptual necessity, although again, it does not exactly say that acquaintance itself holds out of conceptual necessity, just some sort of epistemic contact. At the same time, yeah, it might be maybe the only feature of consciousness that seems to be conceptually necessary and is nevertheless not really part of the starting definition of consciousness, or at least not explicitly. So that makes the feature quite interesting, quite unique. So Chalmers thought that if we acknowledge our acquaintance with consciousness, we can maintain our initial four statements, the conjunction of which was apparently paradoxical. So this means that all these tempting reactions I described earlier, including those that I find most tempting, like the eliminativist move, maybe combined with some sort of partial reductionist move, are in fact not motivated. So if we solve the paradox of phenomenal judgments, then we have no good reasons to embrace eliminativism. However, one other interesting thing in the conscious mind is that Chalmers did not only say that eliminativism is not well motivated, he also thought that it could be directly ruled out, in the sense that he offered some direct consideration against eliminativism, which, quite interestingly, also crucially appeals to acquaintance. So he wrote that eliminativism, quote, denies the evidence of our own experience. This is the sort of thing that can only be done by a philosopher or by someone else tying themselves in intellectual knots. I find it actually curious that it's one occurrence where the term philosopher serves a bit like an insult, which normally it does not. But more interestingly, for what I want to say, in another quote, earlier in the book actually, he wrote, eliminativism about conscious experience is an unreasonable position only because of our own acquaintance with it. If it were not for this direct knowledge, consciousness could go the way of the vital spirit. So, to summarize, what I want to tell you is that in the conscious mind, when you think about it, acquaintance really played an absolutely crucial and unique role. First, it supposedly solved the paradox of phenomenal judgment, which is, remember, in Chalmers' own word, the greatest tension that a non-reductive theory is faced with. So very, very important tool. At the same time, it supposedly allowed us to rule out eliminativism, which might be like the biggest, maybe not the biggest, maybe it's not the right word, maybe the most radical alternative to the picture of the mind that Chalmers was defending. And on top of that, Chalmers suggested, again, without full commitment maybe, that it is conceptually necessary that we are acquainted with our own consciousness. Again, a feature that would make acquaintance really quite exceptional, given that everything else that is said about phenomenal consciousness in the book is supposed to hold as a matter of nomological and not conceptual necessity. Okay, so one other interesting thing that I want to point out is that in contrast with this extremely important and unique role that acquaintance plays in the conscious mind, it is actually quite sparsely discussed in the book. So for example, if you do a quick search on the PDF, you get only 28 hits in the whole book for all acquaintance-related terms, Like acquaintance, acquainted, direct knowledge, intimate epistemic relation, direct evidence. All of that gets you 28 hits, including the reference list and the footnotes, which is not a lot. Almost all of them are in chapter 5, by the way. In contrast, you have 132 hits for quantum, which is also mostly in one chapter. 183 hits for zombie, which is, of course, more important, I suppose. 321 for supervenience. 394 for intention. And, of course, 1,302 for consciousness. Just want you to notice, like, acquaintance is really relatively sparsely discussed compared to the very, very important role and the unique status it had, as I tried to argue. So, was Chalmers entirely happy with this solution to the paradox at the time? So maybe not. He claimed that, yes, acquaintance solves the paradox, it rules eliminativism out, but still he seemed to have thought that something remained a bit worrying. The fact that there was something maybe coincidental in the link between consciousness and phenomenal judgment. So later, not in chapter 5, but at the end of chapter 8, he came back to the paradox, and he wrote, it is counterintuitive that phenomenal judgments might be explained without invoking consciousness itself. But it is something that we can learn to live with. We can still hope, though, that the explanation of phenomenal judgments will be tied in some deep way to the explanation of consciousness itself. It would seem unreasonable and coincidental for these two explanations to be entirely independent. We can put this as a kind of explanatory coherence requirement on the theory of consciousness. A completed theory of mind must provide both a non-reductive account of consciousness and a reductive account of why we judge that we are conscious. And it is reasonable to expect that these two accounts will cohere with each other. Any theory of consciousness that satisfies this requirement will have an element of force to it that other theories will lack. If a theory shows how the explanation of phenomenal judgment centrally involves the explanatory basis of consciousness, then we will have woven the two together into a more unified picture of the mind, and some of the feeling of outrageous coincidence, I want you to remember this outrageous coincidence, will be removed. I've often thought that this might be the key to finding a theory of consciousness. So, let's look now at what happens in the decades following the conscious mind. So in 2003, Chalmers went back to the paradox of phenomenal judgment in the chapter The Content and Epistemology of Phenomenal Beliefs. And there he refined the suggestions of chapter 5 regarding acquaintance, also providing a worked out theory of phenomenal concepts, explaining how phenomenal concepts relate to phenomenal experiences and acquaintance. But to my opinion, I don't know, maybe Dave will disagree, while the view is much more developed than in chapter 5, it is essentially written in the same spirit. I think it shares essentially its spirit. 2003. So now what happens elsewhere? Like, not only reading Chalmers' articles, we can see that during the first 2 decades following the publication of The Conscious Mind, there was really an enormous amount of discussion on phenomenal epistemology and phenomenal concepts, but relatively less attention given to the debunking part of the consideration Chalmers discussed in chapter 5. Still, I think that these considerations played let's say an important and maybe a crucial role in at least 2 major philosophical moments. The first is the apostasy of Frank Jackson. As you all know, Frank Jackson explained in his 1998 postscript on qualia that he abandoned his epiphenomenal dualism, for which he had been so famous, in favor of physicalism, roughly for debunking reasons, and because, according to himself, he accepted the following, I quote, "do not have opinions that outrun what is required by the best theory of these opinions' causal origins. Our knowledge of what it is like to see red and feel pain has purely physical causes." So, very clearly in the direction of the same sort of debunking consideration, a reason to abandon epiphenomenal dualism. So discussing yesterday with Dave, it seems that it might be that reading chapter 5 or discussing with Dave about these ideas could have influenced Jackson on this point, so maybe there is a direct link between what I just presented and this apostasy. The second major philosophical moment where these considerations sort of take the stage is at the publication of the article Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness by Keith Frankish, so published in 2016, which gave the name illusionism to what was like some sort of version of illuminativism, and like did a wonderful job at clarifying, unifying, and promoting the position. And in the article, Keith mentioned as the first positive argument for illusionism, a debunking argument appealing to justificatory parity with zombies and directly referring to chapter 5 of The Conscious Mind. I quote, "The case for illusionism can also be made in a positive way, appealing to explanatory considerations. If phenomenal consciousness is conceived as non-physical, then, as Chalmers notes, there is a simple argument for its being illusory. Phenomenal zombies would make the same assertions we do about their conscious experiences and about consciousness in general, and with the same conviction, and they would have beliefs on those matters with the same causal and explanatory roles as ours. Given this, our claims and beliefs about consciousness afford no evidence for the truth of phenomenal realism." Okay. I think I'm particularly interested in what happened 22 years after the publication of The Conscious Mind, because at this stage there was what I think is an important reconsideration of the topic by Chalmers himself. So it's expressed in two papers. One is The Meta-Problem of Consciousness, published in 2018. This paper was followed by many commentaries and responses to commentaries. And one of these responses to commentaries is particularly important for us. Here, it's the one titled Debunking Arguments for Illusionism About Consciousness. So what is the meta-problem of consciousness? We've already talked about it yesterday. It is a problem of explaining our judgments and intuitions about consciousness without appealing to consciousness itself. So it's a problem whose hypothetical solution was precisely at the basis of the paradox of phenomenal judgment discussed in The Conscious Mind, and which Chalmers in 2018 came to examine for its own sake. So, in these years, Chalmers expressed an interesting change of view. Quote, "I've come to think that while the appeals to acquaintance and constitution go some way to blocking debunking arguments, they do not go all the way. One can get around the reply from acquaintance by moving from an argument about justification to an argument directly about coincidence." He also wrote, "For the realist, what is needed is an explanation that shows how consciousness and meta-problem processes are inextricably intertwined." So, by contrast with 1996, Chalmers then thought first that explanatory irrelevance was not really entirely acceptable anymore. Acquaintance alone was not enough to make it entirely palatable, something we can live with. And second, he also thought that relieving our sense of coincidence, there is now more than just a nice bonus. Like you remember at the end of The Conscious Mind, it said that yes, a theory that manages to remove this sense of coincidence would have some sort of element of force that other theories would lack. But now he formulates it more strongly in terms of what we need to do. So it's not a nice bonus, it's more like a desideratum that a realist theory must satisfy. So here is the debunking argument appealing to coincidence that Chalmers offers in the meta-problem paper. So first premise, there is an explanation of our phenomenal intuitions that is independent of consciousness. Second premise, if there is an explanation of our phenomenal intuition that is independent of consciousness and our phenomenal intuitions are correct, that correctness is a coincidence. Third premise, the correctness of phenomenal intuitions is not a coincidence. Conclusion, our phenomenal intuitions are not correct. So for Chalmers, this argument cannot be countered just with an appeal to acquaintance, and I think it's fairly easy to understand why. This argument does not mobilize any epistemic notions like justification or knowledge, And acquaintance, after all, is supposed to be a putative special source of justification or knowledge, so it's not obvious that it can directly help here. First, you can still say that it helps because you could still sort of suggest that premise 3 actually mobilize implicitly some epistemic notions. But let's set that aside for now. Another very interesting change in those years is that, as Dave said yesterday, in 2018, there is much more sympathy for illusionism, right? In the Metaproblem paper, Chalmers wrote, "If I were a materialist, I would be an illusionist." Of course, just after that, he adds that he's not an illusionist. So just to be entirely frank, it's not clear to me that this represents a genuine change of mind, because if you read the conscious mind closely, there is already the idea that a dose of eliminativism coupled with a debunking stance is the most promising reductivist strategy, one that he associated with Dennett at the time. Still, I think it's fair to say that the sympathy for illusionism became much more explicit and open in 2018. And the paper also heavily referenced illusionist authors like Frankish, Perboom, Humphrey, and Graziano. So why is Chalmers much more, at least explicitly sympathetic to illusionism in 2018 than in 1996? So one obvious explanation is just what he said earlier. Maybe he changed his assessment of the force of the coincidence considerations, which he now sees as supporting illusionism via a debunking argument that cannot be countered with acquaintance. Another explanation that I also find natural is just this. Chalmers, he already said it in the conscious mind, thinks that explaining phenomenal judgments and then linking the explanants that we have found to the basis of consciousness is the key to, I remind you of the previous quotes, finding a theory of consciousness. But very plausibly, as a matter of sociological fact, the thinkers who theorize most about how to explain our phenomenal judgments are very often those who also think that when it comes to consciousness, what we have to explain is judgments and nothing more than judgments. So it's often illusionists. So that would naturally explain this heightened engagement with illusionist theories, roughly because illusionists are, outside of Chalmers himself, the most interested in focusing on the explanation of phenomenal judgments. So in 2018, as I just said, for Chalmers, acquaintance is not enough anymore to make explanatory irrelevance acceptable or to fully counter debunking considerations, because there remains this sense of unpleasant coincidence in the fact that our intuitions about consciousness can be explained independently of consciousness. I just want to pause 1 second and say that in some sense, if you really think about it, it is a bit weird. Because normally, if you think that you have certain infallible justification that P, you don't really care if P then implies also a radical coincidence, right? For instance, suppose that I really fully believe that I have certain ironclad evidence that something super coincidental is happening. That there is someone else in Australia who for the last 10 years sneezed exactly whenever I sneezed. Let's say I have ironclad evidence for this fact. Of course, it would motivate me to search an explanation for this strange fact, but I will never be tempted to doubt the existence of this person or the fact that they do sneeze whenever I sneeze, if really I think that I have ironclad evidence in favor of them. So what I want to suggest is that if Dave thinks that acquaintance is not entirely enough to counter the pro-illusionist debunking worry, that might suggest that maybe now he harbors doubts toward the view that we really are acquainted with our experiences. I'm assuming here that acquaintance, by definition, gives us this sort of infallible, ironclad evidence about the existence of the thing we are acquainted with, so that if Chalmers has doubts, cannot be about, is acquaintance powerful enough? It must be about, are we really acquainted? So at the same time, acquaintance in 2018 ceases to be enough to counter the debunking consideration, but it also ceases to be at the heart of the anti-illusionist argument. So in the conscious mind, remember, Chalmers told us eliminativism can only be ruled out because of our acquaintance with consciousness. But in 2018, his anti-illusionist argument did not explicitly refer to acquaintance at all. So see the argument here that he named the Moorean argument. Premise 1, people sometimes feel pain. Premise 2, if strong illusionism is true, no one feels pain. Conclusion, strong illusionism is false. So of course, I think it is plausible, and actually I believe that the argument only has chances to succeed if indeed we have a unique epistemic relation to phenomenal consciousness, which warrants a special sort of epistemic certainty for the right reading of the first premise, and probably this relation has to be something like acquaintance. But still, I find it interesting to note that acquaintance just is not mentioned here when it comes to arguing against illusionism in 2018. So for these two reasons, acquaintance, which, as I argued, was so important to the conscious mind, seems somewhat less important in 2018, at least explicitly, than in 1996. But at the very same time, in 2018, intuitions of acquaintance become extremely important. Now, Now they are seen as a key explanandum from the point of view of the meta-problem research program. Of all phenomenal judgments, those judgments on the peculiar justificatory profile of conscious states seem really particularly important to explain if we want to solve the meta-problem. I quote Chalmers, "My own tentative view is that the most promising solution to the meta-problem lies in primitive relation attribution," I'm not going to comment on that here, and, importantly, the sense of acquaintance. So let's summarize. From 1996 to 2018, we have illusionism being seen more favorably, acquaintance being treated as less important or maybe less dialectically efficient, but intuitions of acquaintance, understood as physically explainable processes or topic-neutrally explainable processes, now seen as central. So I think that in many respects, it's fair to say that Chalmers in those years moved somewhat in the direction of his illusionist opponents, something that Dave sort of confirmed yesterday. Of course, in my mouth, it's not a criticism. I think he was perfectly right to move in this direction. So what I now want to do in the few minutes that I've left is describe what I think are the next step you should take 30 years after the conscious mind. So what should Chalmers now do, and what should we all do? I think we should treat chapter 5 of the conscious mind and the paradox of phenomenal judgment pretty much in the same way that Karl Marx said we should treat Hegel's dialectic. Marx famously wrote on the second preface to the Capital, "With Hegel, dialectic is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell." Since we're in Germany, I also gave you the German text. "Sie steht bei ihm auf dem Kopf, man muss sie umstülpen, den rationellen Kern in der mystischen Hülle zu entdecken." So, what does that mean for the paradox of phenomenal judgment to do what Marx said we should do about Hegel? In my mind, it means something like keeping roughly the same structure and the same relation between concepts, but changing completely what we treat as fundamental and explanatory. So this move requires to take what we could call a leap of disbelief. So as a first step, what we should do is admit that the coincidence between physically explainable phenomenal judgments and intuitions and phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, is outrageous and indeed unacceptable. And basically, we should embrace illusionism about phenomenal consciousness. The first step is the part where we basically put back the paradox on its feet. However, when we do so, we can still keep a lot of the structure uncovered by Chalmers' argument. For instance, we can and should keep the idea that there is a tight, deep link between acquaintance and consciousness, understood not as a metaphysical link between real entities and real features, but as an inextricable conceptual link between our representations. We can and should also keep the idea that we are indeed presented with the following dialectical alternative. Either we accept consciousness and our acquaintance with it, or we're better off accepting a healthy dose of illusionism. So, what does the result look like? So in the last years, I've tried precisely to develop a view that, in a way, can be read as an attempt at putting Chalmers' paradox back onto its feet. So the result you can read in my book titled House of Mirrors, The Illusion of Phenomenal Consciousness, which I'm very happy to say is now available online. Like the PDF happens to be out since last week, and the book is open access, which means that everyone can right now use their smartphone and go download the PDF for free, either on Oxford Academic or on my website. So in this book, I present a view I call meta-Cartesianism. And here are the main ideas of the view, to the extent that it's relevant to what I just said. So first, my key hypothesis is that phenomenal cognition and evidential cognition are deeply linked. Our intuitive, innate way of representing phenomenal experiences is deeply entangled with our intuitive, innate way of representing epistemic relations. More precisely, we represent phenomenal states exactly as states with which we have sort of uniquely intimate epistemic relation, roughly something in the vicinity of acquaintance. However, the view is illusionist. In reality, there are no states endowed with this specific justificatory profile. So we misrepresent what happens in our own minds when we represent that we are phenomenal experiences, and doing so at the same time, we, ipso facto, so to speak, we misrepresent what determines our epistemic situations and what they consist in. But one interesting bit, I think, is this entanglement between phenomenal cognition and evidential cognition explains, or at least I try to argue in the book, why it's so hard for us to grasp intuitively the truth of illusionism. Precisely because we can't help seeing consciousness as something that we must be acquainted with and which cannot introspectively appear to exist without existing as it appears. So the view is meta-Cartesian, but it's not Cartesian. I could as well say that it is meta-Chalmersian, but not Chalmersian, because the idea is that, roughly speaking, Descartes and Chalmers are wrong about the metaphysics, but their views are a roughly accurate transcript of how our own minds seem to us in introspection, and this fallacious introspective appearance of our own mind to itself is something we can explain and make sense of elegantly once we adopt the right illusionist metaphysics and put the paradox back onto its feet. As a side note, the name meta-Cartesianism was actually suggested to me by Dave. I first wanted to go with a very bad name, which was the Renatian theory, right? Because Descartes' Latin name when he signs in Latin is like Renatus Cartesius. So I thought it would be cool to not call the view Cartesian, but Renatian. But it was a bad idea. It sounded really badly, and it was absolutely not catchy. And Dave, who has many gifts, including the gift of naming, suggested meta-Cartesianism, which I think works 10 times better. So basically, 30 years after the conscious mind, what I want to tell Dave is this. The minor change that you took from 1996 to 2018 already went in the right direction, but you still need to take one more step. It's quite a big step indeed, I agree, since it is no other than the leap of disbelief. But doing so, you will be able to put the paradox of phenomenal judgment back onto its feet, get rid of this outrageous sense of coincidence that plagues phenomenal epistemology. You will have to stop to be Chalmersian, that's true, but you could still be meta-Chalmersian, which is, in my view, even better. So I'm going to skip that and just thank you all for your attention.